Hello and welcome to week 4 of your class. I hope you all had a good break. Today we're going to be doing chapter 7, which discusses forensic anthropology. I have included in your homework assignment a video that helps you to further understand forensic anthropology since we're not meeting in person. There won't be any questions from that on your exam, but I definitely recommend that you watch the video as it will really help you understand this chapter. So, forensic anthropology is a special subfield of physical anthropology and involves applying skeletal analysis and archaeological techniques to analyze skeletons that are found most often in the context of criminal investigations. So, when a human remains or a suspected burial is found, forensic anthropologists are brought in to gather information from the skeleton and the surrounding area to determine as much as possible, who the person was and how they died and how long ago they died. Um, so they specialize in analyzing hard tissue such as bones and teeth. And besides training in anthropological methods, they also train in archaeological methods so they can conduct a dig and bring up the body successfully. This is a type of what's called applied anthropology. So it's anthropology that you can use in a real world setting. So it's not just going out and studying ancient fossils or ancient remains, but is, something that's happening in the real world situation. So when the remains are found, there's a number of questions that the forensic anthropologist needs to answer in order to learn as much as possible about the individual. The first question they must answer is this material even bone? Because there are other items that mimic bone that can be very similar looking to bone, such as the scutes of a tortoise shell. If a tortoise shell falls apart, the scutes can look very much like patellas, like kneecaps. So are you looking at the scattered remains from a tortoise, or are you looking at the remains from a human? So first you have to determine if it's bone. And then if you determine it's bone, then you have to determine, is that bone human? Once you determine the bone is human, then you have to determine how many individuals are present. Because a lot of times in criminal cases, there'll be more than one individual that has been buried. In cases where there's been wars and conflicts, there's often mass burials. How many individuals are in there? So you look at things like, if you have crania, obviously it's very obvious, one head per person. If you, for some reason, don't have any crania, maybe the remains have been scattered or you only have partial remains, then you look at things such as this is why we need to know left from right. You look at how many pelvic bones do you have, how many innominates. If you have two innominates, but they're both from the same side of the body, you have to have a minimum of two individuals at that point. So you determine how many individuals are present. Then you start looking at things such as, can you tell anything about the ancestry of the individual? There are some markers on the bones that are not 100% just for one type of ancestry, but are more common in people from certain ancestries. How old was the individual when they died? How tall were they? So that you can get it helps identify a person if you have some idea of how tall they were in life. Are they male or female? What is there any evidence of health issues or trauma involved in the bones? If you have a missing individual who broke their leg at some point in time, and you have leg bones, you can look at those leg bones and go, do they have a matching break that has healed? That gives good odds that that's that missing person. If the missing person has broken a bone during their life and it's healed, there's going to be visible evidence on that bone. If they broke their right femur and the right femur of the individual that you have found has never been broken, then it's not that missing individual. And you look at any trauma that has occurred to the bones, and there's 3 different types of areas or zones of trauma. One is Antemortem, that means before death. So that is things like, did they break a bone in childhood? Something that happened before the person died. And you can usually see signs of healing if it's something that's happened far enough before the person died. Is it perimortem, which is something that happened around the time of death? Often a perimortem injury can be the cause of death if it's severe enough. And then there's postmortem, which is breaks that occur to the bone after the individual has died. Did the killer chop them up at all after death? Because if you're already dead, your blood's not pumping. The appearance of the breaks are going to be different than breaks that occurred during the time of death while the person was still alive. Or is it stuff that happened because the individual was buried in a shallow grave and partially dug up and animals scavenged some of the bones, that kind of thing. So ante, peri, and postmortem are the three areas that we look at in that case. So when we are documenting human variation, we do it through two main ways. One is anthroposcopy, and that's visual evidence. Qualitative, what do we see? Did the individual have a cleft chin or not? Did the individual have what's called shovel-shaped incisors, was a particular shape of their incisors? Did they have a brow ridge or not? These are things that you can't measure. You don't measure them. It's just they're either there or they're not there. And the second is anthropometry. And anthropometry is measurable things. So quantitative, measurable. How long is their femur? How tall is their skull? Things like that. So they're actual measurements that we can take. When we measure things in anthropology, because we're a science, we use the metric system. All right. So if you don't have a lot of experience with the metric system, the best way to remember is 1 inch is the same as 2.54 centimeters. So you can kind of go back and forth. And then 1 centimeter is 10 millimeters. Because sometimes if you're measuring small amounts, you're going to be measuring in millimeters instead of centimeters. The problem with measuring with anthropometry is that there is both between observers, inter-observer error, and intra-observer error, which is the same person. Because when you're measuring something, especially something round like a skull, it's very hard to get your measuring tool in exactly the same place every time. So there is a range of error that has to be taken into account. Now, if you look on page 177 in your book, it shows the landmarks of the skull that are used when you're measuring. So there's two types of tools that are used to measure the skull. Now, this is a giant set of calipers. All right. This is not the size that you would actually use, but it's like a demo set of calipers. So when you pull it apart to get you'd use these ends. If I want to measure the width of my skull, I put it on, find them, if I was doing a skull, I'd put it on there, and then I'd come down here, I'd come here and look at what number is in this little hole here, and that tells me the measurement. So these are called spreading calipers. So they spread out, and they're used for rounded objects like a skull. What's the width of the skull? What's the length of the skull? Things like that. We use our spreading calipers. Then if we're going to measure interior spaces, so what if I wanted to measure how wide is the opening to the orbit here? Then we use what's called sliding calipers. So these are sliding calipers. They're called that because they slide back and forth. And again, the number that you're getting in this little box here, and there's a line so you can see exactly where, that's giving you the measurement. So if I want to measure the width of the orbit, I would take my sliding calipers and I'd put it in there, and then I'd open them up until they completely fill that area, and then look at the number, and I get 1.1 centimeters. So that would give me the measurement. And you do that with, you can do that with the orbits. A lot of times you're doing nasal aperture. So you're measuring the width of the nasal aperture or the height of the nasal aperture. And because you're doing it interiorly, it's your sliding calipers that can fit into that interior space and give you your measurement. There are also ways of measuring the postcranial skeletons. We have what measurement boards where you can take the long bones and put them in there and determine how long the long bones are. That's used to estimate height, especially if you're lucky enough to have femurs. The femurs are the best one for estimating height, but they have formulas for how, if the femur is this many centimeters plus, then you have a plus or minus error. Excuse me. It'll the estimated height of the person is, a certain amount, and it talks about this more in your book. But if you have the femur and the tibia, that gives you an even better estimate because you have both leg bones. And so you keep on, the more information you have, the more precise you can be in your estimate of things such as height or age or any of those. So we determined that we have human bones, and we've figured out how many individuals we have. We can measure the crania to get information from that, which will give us some tendencies towards certain ancestry, because some people of certain ancestries have, broader heads or broader nasal apertures. And so it's not 100%, but it will give us a tendency. And then we want to know what sex individual, because obviously the police need to know if they're looking at a male or a female, because then they can then match it back to their missing persons records. So the best place to learn that from is from the pelvis. Okay.